Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the 10th episode of Sharing Management, Business and Personal Challenges from the Pandemic. I don't think when I started this up 10 weeks ago that I had really an idea that 10 weeks on we would still be getting such a large number of people coming on to watch the weekly call with feedback like compulsive viewing. So we will endeavour to continue to meet your high standards. As always, a great panel today, preceded by a poll. But let me just remind you, what are some of the issues that you have been telling us matter? We've talked about the optimal role and the multiple styles of an effective leader. You can't always have the same style. Making sure people are in a safe office environment. Thinking about your firm's reputation while making tough decisions, and we'll be exploring the reputation aspect a little bit more in today's call. Winning work from new clients to sustain the workforce. Maintaining team productivity, morale, mental health, and well-being. Planning for this new normal. Are we beginning to move away from firefighting into a planning mode? We'll talk a bit more about professional relationships next week, but there's a poll today covers that to some extent, but general strategies for communicating through novel channels. How are we serving local and international clients in this social distance world with frontiers closed to us? Some of the financial metrics and people focusing perhaps a bit more on client solvency than in the past. How you manage suppliers and what are the key contract clauses? A contract at the end of the day is just a data set. The whole piece about cybersecurity and phishing, about rationing your own time, and that's a really important one because we all have emergencies, but are you keeping enough free time for the real ones? And are you getting time to realize that everyone needs some downtime? And that includes you, obviously. For those of you who've been on the call already, I think you've seen this slide, but I really like it. It says, these are 7 strategies when facing a pandemic. First of all, think big. As Lewis Carroll said, you've got to believe 6 impossible things before breakfast. Remember that you are the power of your connections, but any favors you must reciprocate, otherwise it doesn't work. Also, think small. Think about angles that will resonate with your key audiences. Do a series, not a one-off, because this really does help convert an audience into a community. Drop the convention. You've got to go for new ideas and new services. And remember that speed is of the essence, and this is all about lean start. So you've got to articulate and then market test your assumptions. And if they prove invalid, and many will, amend them and pivot in a new direction. And lastly, be entrepreneurial. And as that says, keep listening and innovating. And actually, interesting, the key word in that sentence is listening. If you're not listening to what your clients are telling you, to what your people are telling you, you won't be delivering what you could. And that's from Elena Kudska of Globsec talking last month. So thank you, Elena, for those great list of 7. So what's been going on? Today's panel. First of all, I'd like to welcome back Francesca, who is, as always, going to be giving her insight, her video diary at one level, but also her take on some of the key topics for today. Dave Weaver, from the Head of Professional Services, NatWest. Now he's going to be talking, I think, about how the finance directors are coping. Are they moving away from firefighting mode? Are they now beginning to get involved in more strategic planning for their firms? Stefanie is coming in from Venturis. She's based in Frankfurt and is giving us a perspective as to what the continental law firms, how are they coping, particularly the more active mid-market firms. Jonathan from Hemus of Insignia is then saying, well, okay, obviously things won't always happen. People are all isolated. Sometimes people do things that you might regret. The media is slightly more less forgiving possibly than it was a month or 2 ago. So what is it that you might be thinking of doing when things happen that you're not too happy about and people show an unusual degree of interest? And Lucy, as always, good morning, Lucy, is joining us from Bays and we'll be giving her thoughts and insights. And it's great to have her on the call because we know that means that whilst the government may not agree with everything we're doing, at least that way we know that the points are being shared with government directly and there's nothing better than that. And obviously yours truly doing what I try and do best. So that's today's panel. So welcome one and all, and that's the order in which you'll be hearing from them very shortly. But for those of you again who've been on the call before, the next step we look is the poll. And I thought it would be quite interesting, thank you government, to basically give you a little bit of feedback from a couple of the polls last week, because one of the challenges about Zoom polls is that they give you immediately the results, but they don't really allow you to actually compare results at different points in time. They're just not that sophisticated. So what we try and do is look at, are there any particular messages emerging from the poll? And because, as some people say, a COVID week is the equivalent of 6 normal months, we can now compare the poll on the 3rd of April and the one which we took last week to see are the attitudes changing, or are things happening vis-a-vis furloughing? And I think what's quite clear from that, 3rd of April is the blue, 15th of May is the sort of red, that actually firms are less likely to be using the furloughing than they are the current scheme, but the numbers are still quite large. I think that's about all I'll say. And in terms of the level of dip in firms' income, again, going back to April, that's obviously the blue. These were the sort of percentages that were emerging last week. Again, quite big numbers, but 20% still very much in that sort of space. But the previous week it was a little bit higher, was the top one. So there's sort of people, if you like, the panic is over slightly and people are now adjusting to a new normal. But as we've seen from the government stats this week from the Office of National Statistics, the next set of quarterly numbers are going to be quite dire, way beyond any numbers we've ever seen in our lives, I think, in terms of production and the rest. So the third one I just wanted to pick up from last week, was quite interesting to me, was because, as you know, we also organize a marketing group, is the role of marketing. Not so much is it changing, but are marketing people actually being used in the right way by firms? And what's quite fascinating from this is that if you compare some of what I call the staples, and looking across, that would be, say, CRM, pitch support, and Marcoms. If anything, probably the red line, which was last week, is the ideal, is probably a bit lower than the actual usage. So yeah, important, obviously. If I then start looking at the things to do with supporting partners, the whole area of coaching advisors, that's jumped from 50 to 64. If I start looking at pricing strategies, 16 up to 42. So helping partners, could be doing more of that. If I look at the whole idea of approaching clients, sourcing new clients, 29, suddenly 55. Direct approaches, marketing people haven't done that very much yet, 44% are seen as should be doing that stuff. And then being the honest broker to a client, which is an even harder one, because sometimes you might be honest and say, well, actually, we're not very good at doing that stuff, doubled from 11 to 23. And then the final two, which is all about helping essentially the leadership team. It's not being sort of getting downward feedback. These days, you're actually seen as that sort of change agent, and you're actually seen to be needing to help the managing partner or the team generally with developing new services, particularly around the market implications. So you've got a set of expertise here, could be in-house, could be hired, doesn't matter, which isn't being properly deployed. And that's the message coming back from the members who completed last week's poll. So I thought that one was quite interesting. Looking into this week, I wanted to do a slightly different poll, which is to talk about relationships and try and get a sense as to the extent to which some of the key metrics associated with professional relationships, and particularly around winning work. And you can see from this poll of a week or two ago, there are clearly some pretty adverse consequences that are being seen from social distancing on their ability to actually win work from new clients. And I appreciate there's more than relationships, but that's a key part of it. So I thought it'd be quite interesting to do that. So now moving to the poll, if I may, what I'll do. Okay, right, I'll now end the poll. And we've just got a couple more just came in, so that was well done, just under the line. So poll ended. Let's just share the results. So what are we seeing? And the ones you need to watch out for, you can scroll down, are the red ones. I'll just try and talk you through the first one. So this is really about how you're nurturing the relationship. 7 out of 10 is the one that most people do, but the range goes from all the way from a few people on 3 and a few people on 10. So it's a fairly broad spread. Next question looks at people typically have strongest professional relationships with are similar. That again is about a 7 on that one, not so many on the lower one. So if I'm looking at are people typically active social media, 6 to 7. Following up into the new contacts, a bit lower at 6. Do they have, how good are they maintain contacts with them they have already a relationship? A little bit higher at 8. That doesn't wholly surprise me. Are they typically giving weight to relationship building in their day-to-day activity? That's down to 6. Down when we're looking at people showing comfortable in asking for help and showing vulnerability, we're definitely dropping down into the lower half. That's 4 to 5. On the other hand, do they have people who are going to give them advice and network? 6 to 7. Are they typically asking for introductions rather than reaching out on their own? About 5. And do they typically regularly support their networks and ask for help is 7. So we've got a picture there of the people who are on the call. So that's probably about enough for me for the moment. So I will now hand over to Francesca, who's going to give you her insight on her week, but also some of the key issues that we've talked about this week, which, if you recall, are finance and the finance function, the issues emerging across different countries, which I know she's totally familiar with that space, and lastly, obviously, the crisis management piece.
Wonderful. That's a nice broad range of stuff for me to cover. I'll focus on a couple of those, and there's some great experts coming and others too. And enjoy that toast there, Richard. Welcome, everybody. Lovely to be back. Thank you very much for joining us again, those of you regular returners. I wanted to pick up on a couple of pieces as well as we were going through today. I think at the forefront of most of our minds, wherever we're sitting in the world, is the whole piece around going back. How do you go back to work? Be physically going back to an office, going to a client, or any variation around returning to whatever the new world is going to look like. I've been speaking to a couple of people this week, and it's just fascinating to see how different parts of the world are in such different stages, such unusual stages. If you talk to people in Hong Kong and China, they're very much going back into offices, very much going back onto the street, lots of mask wearing, lots of respecting of each other's social distance, but a huge drive back into what will be a more traditional working environment, often driven by the fact that they live in smaller accommodation on the whole, particularly high density accommodation in the big cities. So working at home has been incredibly difficult and very hard to manage. Compare and contrast with a lot of Western Europe, where they do have the ability perhaps to have a little bit more space, not such high density housing. And our Irish firm went back this week, and most people chose not to return. They had an option whether they went to the office or not, and many people said, no, I'm okay working from home at the moment. And they're sussing out what public transport might be like, what are the risks, and how is that going to look. So an intriguing divide occurring in different parts of the world around going back. In the UK this week, of course, it's Mental Health Week. And one of the issues that we've talked about many times on these calls has been the impact of social isolation. And that is really becoming a very, very hot topic, because how do you manage that in a way that's responsible for an employer, but also around really recognizing how difficult some people have been finding the last 10 weeks in the UK and longer in other parts of the world. So mental health, hugely important part of this whole pandemic and how we come out of it, especially as a lot of businesses now are talking about not returning to the traditional office, not coming back into an office space, and making working from home more of a norm than an unusual piece. So a lot still to be done, I feel, around that particular topic. Last but not least, we've been spending this week with our international business community. We have individuals around the world who help smooth the client work that we do across borders. And normally we'd have them all together. We'd be sitting, I think we would have been sitting in Europe this week doing that particular session. And instead we did it over 3 days in different time zones with all our various IBCs present. And we brought clients along. So clients were explaining what it's been like working across borders and how they've had that same issue around different countries in such different stages. But what really came over strongly was how much business is still carrying on. There have been problems, there have been difficulties, there's been challenges. But I think to Richard's point, 1 week in COVID is 6 months in a normal life. People are finding answers with such speed. It's quite extraordinary. And we had one particular client who works primarily in the Caribbean, and then in bits of Africa, and then also in bits of Europe. And the 3 completely different environments. And yet they found answers and solutions to the way that they do business in the sort of speed that they said would normally have taken years, because they've had to keep their business going. They've had to do that. And that's been utterly fascinating. And we also taught there a nice piece of research coming out of the Edelman Trust. It's Edelman Trust do a trust barometer. They look at 11 countries, 11 quite core countries, and they've shown in their recent issue, which was done on a survey right about the tail end of April, so right in the heart of the pandemic, how many people are moving towards trusting their government more than they've perhaps ever trusted before, and be willing to give up rights because of that, but they're beginning to trust businesses, or perhaps unfairly, the leadership of those businesses. Are they really doing the right things by them? So an interesting piece coming through about how are the leaders of our businesses rising to the challenge. And there's certainly much more to be done in that space too, as people are wondering, well, what happens next? Where's the next stage for us? So some very positive things, and then also some challenges for us as we go forward into whatever the new normal proves to be. Thank you, Richard.
Well, thank you very much, Francesca. Wonderful insights as always. And you have such a broad panorama. I'm surprised at time you even know what time of day it is. But and you say good morning or good evening to people. I'm sure you've worked that one out too. Dave, come join us. Welcome, Dave Weber, who heads up the professional practices division of NatWest, as you know, is one of the major lenders to our sector. And Dave has been, apart from working from home like all of us, been talking to a lot of finance directors, and be really interested to hear what he has to say. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Richard, and good morning, everyone. So, I mean, from our discussions with finance directors and finance teams, I think top of their in tray, and quite rightly, in my view, I would say that as a banker, is still liquidity, ensuring the firm has sufficient liquidity, and whether that be, it can involve securing new financing through their bank as well. So, and that's not just to survive the current crisis, but actually to come, when we come out of it, to actually sort of thrive as a business. And in NatWest, I'm sure it's the same at other banks. All been very, very busy trying to support our customers through the crisis. And just to give a little feel for some of the numbers, in NatWest we've lent over £5.5 billion worth of loans under the various government-backed schemes, which has been great. Provided 6,000 new overdrafts to firms, and I think over nearly 50,000 capital repayment holidays. So been pretty active. And in the profs, the kind of profs market, I guess across the mid-market and the larger corporates, they were very quick out of the blocks in terms of approaching their banks, quite often multi-banks, for kind of additional liquidity top-ups. And usually that's a short-term increase to their revolving credit facility, not necessarily because they needed the funds there and then, but actually partners preferred operating with that additional degree of liquidity buffer. And across the more of the kind of commercial space, we've seen quite a high volume of CBILS, the coronavirus business interruption loan scheme facilities. And I think that's partly driven by the partnership model, as we know, and it doesn't lend itself naturally to retention of value and cash in the business. So we have been pretty active, and of course we've seen firms avail themselves of other government support, whether that be furloughing staff or deferring tax into next year. Talking to FDs, I think there's a growing sense that we're in a bit of a false storm right now, and there is a bit of nervousness around the impact later this year when perhaps furloughing ends and the fixed cost base gets switched back on. Perhaps the recovery isn't quite as sharp as we originally expected. And of course, we've got a looming tax bill early next year. There is a sense that in Q4 and Q1 is quite a dangerous time. So, I would say this as a banker, keep very, very sharp focus on cash flow, engage with your relationship manager, whether that's NatWest or another bank, as early in that process as possible. What else are they focusing on? It definitely goes beyond liquidity now. Okay, so new business, how firms actually kind of engage, do new business, client management in these very different times. It's probably more important than ever to do that, to actually ensure your profile is out there, you're keeping in touch with your key customers, your target names, your key contacts. And there are different ways to do that. It's not easy, and there are experts, and I think Richard mentioned someone's coming on at another time to talk about that. So there are firms out there that can share best practice. Well-being, finance directors need to ensure the physical and mental well-being of their teams is being very, very well looked after. Clear leadership at the moment in that area is critical as we come out of not just the sort of chaos stage, which it sort of feels like we're coming out of now, but to the sort of new normal, it still remains very relevant. And a lot of finance directors we're finding are really just taking this moment to actually reflect and think forward in terms of, right, what are the longer term impact and implications from COVID-19 on the firm? And that might be through flexible working. Okay, we've seen the sector transition pretty well to working from home. But what does that mean longer term? Will will partners and fee earners return to the office? What are the implications in terms of commercial real estate? Do employees have the right level of tech? What does that mean in terms of tech investments? We've seen new ways of doing business and keeping the show on the road, whether that's kind of virtual court hearings, or it might be remote audits, or even the use of drones undertaking stock counting. It's been really, really interesting to see. So how will that continue to evolve going forward? And of course, the kind of the point we often go to is will this trigger an acceleration of digitization? So automation and AI, will we finally see that kind of adopted en masse within the sector, or actually will we just see a move to kind of where a lot of other sectors are now, using Zoom technology? Will we really see sort of a catalyst for fundamental change? And as a bank, we're just alive to some of those discussions and thoughts, and just being kind of cognizant of how we might better support on that journey. So yes, Richard, I mean, the role of the finance team is definitely changing, and it's very much moving outside of their traditional finance roles. And that's kind of probably it from me.
Thanks very much, Dave. I remember back in 2008, that ages me, doesn't it, that all of a sudden the finance director said, gosh, all of a sudden we're important again. And I sense that probably a number of them will probably have that hidden thought as well, given what you've just told us about their remit covering many things beyond what people think finance directors focus on alone, which is the money. But the question is, where does the money come from, and how do you make sure that it's spent wisely? So pretty key issues emerging there strategically. I'd now like to hand over to Stefanie, who, as I mentioned before, is from Francesca, which is a strategy marketing consultancy based across Europe. She's based in Frankfurt, but has worked within a Magic Circle law firm for a number of years in a very global client relationship role, so has a very good understanding and amazing English, if I can say that in advance. So welcome, Stefanie.
Thank you very much, Richard. I hope I will be living up to your language expectations here. Yeah, no, I'm delighted to be here. Good morning, everyone. Since the crisis hit 2 months ago, my colleagues and I at Ventura's Consulting Group have spoken to roughly 35 to 40 managing partners of law firms across a wide range of European countries. And to no great surprise, the vast majority of them are also, as Dave said, with the CFOs, focused on cash and expense management. Yeah, so debt collection, restriction of partner withdrawals, etc., as well as thinking and evaluating about projects and putting them on hold has been top of the agenda and continues to be top of the agenda. And so this, in combination with top financial results in Q1 that most of the firms have had, and very good Q2 results, has led to the fact that some firms have more liquidity than ever before. Yeah, so they have that additional buffer, Dave, you were referring to. And it is interesting that most of them expect Q3 to be the decisive quarter where firms will be seeing how the impact, in particular, of the transactional work pipeline drying up will be at that point in time. What we see far less often, and only by few firms, and those who had a financial year end at April, is firms combining their budgeting process with a strategic review process, focusing short-term on liquidity management, but also on client, market, and sector analyses to assess their client and services portfolio going forward, how to adapt to changing markets, where to invest countercyclically, and how to reflect this in the budget. And we do speak to a few firms, but they are in the minority, about how to budget most sensibly at times of uncertainty. How do you do that? Yeah. Moving on to people, I can also echo what Francesca and Dave have said before. Vast majority of firms in continental Europe have still 80% of their workforce working from home. With a relaxation of some of the restrictions in some countries, for example, in the Netherlands, Germany, Austria, and Switzerland, also managing partners are working on concepts of bringing people back in, respecting physical distancing and other health and safety requirements, and it doesn't prove to be easy to do that. It's a real tricky space. And generally working from home is being seen as something that will not go away, that will continue, that's here to stay, both crisis related for a number of months, but also beyond. Thus, managing virtual teams has become more urgent, and that refers back to what, Francesca, you were saying about the Mental Health Week in the UK now. Mental health is an issue also, and obviously on the continent. If you look at the study that the INSEAD Business School published in March-April 2020, 80% of participants said that their employer's IT infrastructure worked very effectively in supporting them in working from home. But only 50% of them said that their bosses and managers were effectively supporting them at working from home. And so it is very dependent in law firms that we have spoken to on individual partners, how they deal with that. Communication is very much done on individual team basis. If you look at the overall communication from management to the rest of the firm, that's very much still traditional top-down management, top-down communication, often still by email. Often when they do town halls in virtual environments, there aren't many questions. And what seems to be missing in sort of providing teams with the psychological safety they are striving for is developing formats of interaction and communication, i.e. dialogue between management and the firm, and moving beyond the individual teams. In moving on to clients, because you have also referred to that before, we have seen loads of firms creating a huge quantity of helpful information for clients to tackle immediate effects of the crisis. And if you look at all of the Corona task forces work that you can witness on websites, newsletters, webinars, etc., that's been amazing. And given most firms have been very busy, yeah, that's a great achievement. What is a shame, though, is that many firms then have distributed and still distribute that valuable content quite indiscriminately to hundreds and thousands of people on their distribution lists, without topping and tailing it, without thinking about target audiences. And you will be familiar in the UK of complaints from clients that we've heard on the continent as well. We are swamped by information, but hardly any partner picks up the phone, asks a number of good questions and listens. Going back to your, Richard's, word of listening is the key thing in a crisis. So, and it also shows that many firms are still lacking clarity around which clients are really strategically important. Which should be the clients that they focus their care and communication on, and how to stage that according to that importance. And client communication continues to be very dependent on email and personal meetings. It's not only in Italy, where you would have thought that it is a natural reply. You hear it also across many other countries where partners say, I can't develop business, I can't go out for lunch. Well, what do you say then? So summarizing, at least 50% of managing partners we've spoken to across the different jurisdictions are still in the first phase of crisis management, cash, cost management, operational activity. Understandable, we are only 2 months into the crisis, and if you think about the huge change that is happening, traditionally more conservative jurisdictions as Germany and Italy are particularly slow in moving to the next stage required. We see far more firms, for example, in the Netherlands and in the Nordics, that are already thinking strategically about learnings from previous crises in order to avoid that you make the same mistake again, the future needs of their clients, and also counter-cyclical investment opportunities. And very much as well, one thing that many firms need to look at, how to address the to be expected pressure on cost and demands for higher efficiencies, whether that is through pricing and alternative pricing, technology investments, etc. So very few firms have already moved into that space. Thank you, Richard. Over to you again.
Well, thank you very much, Stefanie. That was a real sort of very, I have to listen to that again. There was just so much knowledge packed into those few minutes. So thank you very much. That was really, really insightful and helpful. And as you said, the fact that half the firms are still in crisis management mode is kind of takes us quite quickly, I think, on to Jonathan. And this is perhaps more when something happens because you're isolated, frontline leader, communicating ineffectively with the frontline middle manager, head of department, whatever. That doesn't work. Somebody does something that they then regret, but somebody else picks it up and runs with it. So, Jonathan, talk us through what happens next.
So, thank you, Richard, and good morning to everyone. I'm actually going to take it back a stage and things that I think you could be thinking about doing now so that you are ready to respond when the kind of situation that Richard has described happens. Clearly, two words have been mentioned that I'm going to pick up on in this conversation, two really important words: reputation and trust. And I think you would all agree that for every professional services firm, you need both of those things. Basically, they are your biggest assets. You need a strong reputation, and you need to be trusted by your stakeholders, in particular your clients and your people. And sadly, I think reputation and trust is particularly vulnerable now. And I say specifically now because I think when you are in that early firefighting phase of the crisis, in some ways, it's quite obvious what needs to be done. And so you focus on managing cash flow and those immediate things that it's very clear have to happen. And I think we are now coming out of that immediate firefighting phase. We're certainly at the end of it. And I think coming to that moment in time, many firms and many businesses of all kinds are now in a weakened state. We don't have all of our systems working quite as well as they used to work. We don't have our team near to us. We have members of staff who are still getting to grips with new ways of working from home and the technology. Our supply chains may not be working as well as we would like them to have done. So we are not operating at 100% capacity and efficiency at the moment. Therefore, we are in a weakened state. And I know you've covered this on previous sessions, but what that means is people like cyber criminals are upping their game at the moment and are actively targeting organizations because they know they are in a weakened state. The other big danger that I would encourage you to avoid, and we're seeing some good practice and some not so good practice amongst the people that we're talking with, is clearly it is important to focus on the opportunities going forward. Clearly it is important to develop the organization so it is ready to succeed in this new normal. But it's important not to just focus on the upside. Now is also a time for planning about how we protect reputation and trust, as well as how we capitalize on new opportunities. So I'd like to cover two areas briefly. How do we protect those assets of reputation and trust now? And I'd like to talk about some practical things that I think a number of our clients are thinking about, and I'd encourage you to think about too. And secondly, some cultural things that I think will help you to be ready if that situation occurs that Richard described of someone doing or saying the wrong thing. So practical measures first of all. So the most important thing probably of anything that I'm going to say is, please don't go straight from firefighting the initial crisis to business as usual as it can be in this new phase without pausing. I would strongly recommend a review of what happened in that first phase and drawing the learnings out of that before immediately going back into something like business as usual. And I think there are at least two parameters to learnings. One is specifically around your crisis management response. Many of you will have had crisis management plans and teams that you activated a couple of months ago. Out of crisis comes opportunity. This is an opportunity to assess whether that plan as it was previously structured actually worked, what was good about it, what was really effective about it, and what didn't work and what was missing, and make sure that you take time now to address that, because there may be a second crisis just around the corner, sadly. And the second thing is also to take stock of how the leadership teams yourselves that have been working on this crisis, about how you feel about how you responded to that crisis, and again, just taking stock of people's energy levels and ways of working. How can we sustain this level of effort over the coming 3, 6, 12 months? What do we want to, hang on to? What's worked really well in terms of the new working structures? Where are we feeling not so comfortable with how things have been working over the last couple of months? So absolutely take stock and review your crisis management plan and how effectively it worked, and also your ways of working during this challenging period. Secondly, and it was something that Dave touched on about, the future implications, again, of how we take business forward. Do reassess your risk landscape, because I'm sure you've all done risk assessments, but what we are seeing is that the risk assessment that appeared to be, true and relatively objective 2 or 3 months ago is no longer the risk landscape that you are facing. So again, I would encourage you to reassess the risks facing your firms in the context of the external world as it now is and your firm as it now is, because there is no way that that risk landscape is going to be the same today as it was 2 months ago. So you need to be prepared for the risks as they stand now, not the risks as they look like 2 months ago. Third thing I've touched on, so I'll just say it again briefly, please do update your crisis management plans and processes now. This is a wonderful opportunity, if I can put it that way. You've had an impromptu rehearsal of your crisis management procedures. Please learn from them and make sure that you're even better prepared on the basis of what you've learned. And the fourth thing in the practical bucket is make sure that anyone who is required to enact those plans and processes are briefed on them, briefed on the changes that you will have made on the basis of those learnings. You don't want, again, to have to activate your crisis management infrastructure and people be working on the old set of processes when actually you've made some really great enhancements to them. So that's the practical things. In the last 2 or 3 minutes, I'd also like to talk about some of the cultural things. Now, again, I said at the start, and I think you'd all agree that your long-term success is based on your reputation and the trust of your stakeholders. Retaining that at the moment is as much a cultural matter as it is a practical matter, and you can have a really important influence on creating a crisis-resistant culture. And we've got about 10 characteristics of a crisis-resistant culture, but I wanted to pull out 4 of them for this session. The first one being really important, and it again plays to Richard's setup of this session. In this new virtual work of people working from home, everybody in your firm needs to know that if they spot a problem or if they cause a problem, that they need to alert the appropriate person. That requires there to be a culture, and again, it's a phrase that was used earlier on, of psychological safety, in which people are encouraged and thanked for saying, I have spotted a problem. I have clicked on something that I suspect may be a phishing email. So you need to create that culture of psychological safety in which you get to hear about issues and incidents before they have exploded into a crisis. So please do encourage everyone to flag issues up. And a small practical second point on my first point, let them know who they are supposed to tell. It sounds simple, but who are they supposed to tell if they spot a problem? Make sure that's clear. Second thing culturally, and this comes down to, integrity. The last thing you want at the moment is, an integrity-focused crisis at the moment. This is a moment when you need to make sure that you do not accommodate mavericks. Often mavericks are star performers who tend to play outside of the rules. You need everybody living by the same culture, living by the same values without rule breakers. So if you want to, particularly when people are working virtually in a disparate workforce, if you want to avoid some of those integrity-based crises, be very firm around governance, what the rules are, what the culture is, and do not allow those star performer mavericks to operate in a different way to everybody else. Third area of culture, beware the unintended consequences of incentivization. This is particularly important when a firm is in a weakened state. If, for example, people are incentivized purely on financial performance alone, it's going to be really hard for them to hit those targets at the moment. And if that's what their pay is based upon, you may get some people being very creative around how they achieve those targets. That is the last thing you want at the moment. So make sure that the way in which you're incentivizing, rewarding, and recognizing people results in the right behaviors. And the final part of the culture mix, and probably the most important part, is living and leading by example. Be a champion of a crisis-resistant culture. Be the one thanking someone who has brought a problem to your attention. Be the one who, when you run your next crisis exercise, is the first one in the room and dedicating the 3 hours to it, rather than the person who says, I'm too busy, this isn't important enough for me to be there. So, in summary, now is a very vulnerable phase of this situation, particularly for reputation and trust. Don't make it this far through the crisis only to fall victim to a second, maybe unrelated crisis over the next few months. Take those practical steps to be ready, but also make sure you're focusing on creating a crisis-resistant culture.
Oh, thanks very much. That was really interesting, Jonathan, and covered, again, a massive amount of material. I think this idea of doing the stock take of how have you got through the first phase and what can you learn from it, something we can all take away from. So thank you hugely for that. Lucy, good morning to you. Please, you can join us again today. It's lovely. Any particular thoughts from Bays before we move into the discussion part?
So not really. It's been a bit of a quiet front for government this week. We've kind of been busy working behind scenes. One thing, it was great to hear today that people have been able to access Sybil's. We've been working really hard to make this more accessible for business this week. And again, we've been feeding back that the job retention scheme, we need greater flexibility sooner than the end of July. So that's been something we've been working towards. And also just a little snippet into kind of working in government and how we've been doing this week. As much as everyone, it's a bit of a strange time for us all. It's Mental Health Awareness Week, as was mentioned earlier. We've been having some really candid conversations in government. Supporting our staff is more important than ever. We're in the midst of a huge change, and people are facing kind of long periods of isolation. And just for ourselves and the way we work, we're looking at the new normal. The pace we've been working on policy, it's kind of given a new definition to agile working in government. And the collaboration that's come from it has been great. So I think going forward, we're going to be working with business when we're developing our policy. We're going to be working more closely. And again, we're looking at bolstering our regional offices, which is something which is quite unlike government. They love their London-centric offices and Whitehall. So we're going to bolster our regional offices. And we're already quite privileged to be quite a flexible department. But we're kind of looking at the new normal and working from home. A lot of people find that they enjoy working from home most of the time, and they want to live. They want to live across the country. They want to be able to have that flexibility for that work-life balance. So yeah, so that's a little snippet into kind of behind the policy scene, the human aspect this week.
That's great, and as most people would know, I mean, we have people on this call from Aberdeen to Plymouth, so definitely the regional dimension is, I think, very important, because often the man from Whitehall, I think they used to call it, didn't they, is not always the stereotype that works very well for either side, quite frankly. Right, we've got a little bit of time left now. There's certainly a question from Joanna around the finance directors, which perhaps, Dave, you might want to address quickly.
Yeah, sure, no problem. Thanks for the question, Joanna. I mean, I guess there's a...
Sorry, can you just say what the question is? That would be helpful, Dave, if that's okay.
I sure can. Hang on. This is fascinating, especially on firms actually not feeling the financial pinch yet. What would you say finance directors should be doing right now to protect or ensure cash flow post-lockdown, post-furlough, etc. I mean, there's a few things to think about. I mean, the first one I'd say is regular forecasting, regularly sort of assessing cash flows, and include some realistic downside scenarios. You know, no one is certain what the shape of this kind of recovery is going to look like and how it's going to play out. It's moving all the time. So regular forecasting, and consider the entire supply chain, and focus heavily on the debtor book. So from my experience, I mean, I've seen cash collections generally holding up okay, but there is a sense out there that, you know, sort of some debtors are preserving liquidity somewhat, you know, and then we can start thinking about other sectors. So what happens if 25% of retail doesn't reopen, for example? What is the impact on the business there? And we've seen a few examples recently of firms moving to payment on account, trying to get some of the funds, some of the work up done, or some of the funds for the work up front. That's been quite an interesting development, a very sort of change of mindset amongst fee earners. And then I guess finally, you know, early engagement with your banker. I would say that.
Okay, great. Mike's question has come in, and I don't know whether, Francesca, you want to talk a little bit about if change in psychological needs of firms' leadership, and you probably talk to more firm leaders than most of us, and is that something you've identified? I mean, feel free to pass on to somebody else if you'd rather not.
No, sure. Happy to begin that. Others may want to jump in as well. Psychological needs of leadership. Well, I think often if you're the person who's motivating your team, who's dealing with all the issues, who's trying to keep people engaged, there's an enormous pressure. Are you actually got a team? Have you got a team around you who can provide you with the support that you need so that you can support the firm? And just seeing a lot of leaders under ridiculous stress. We've talked many times on here about digital presenteeism, but one of the things that you tend to find is that the leaders in charge get called onto lots and lots of Zoom calls and team calls, and they have very little time to think. And that's been a major issue that you're seeing everywhere. Are people actually having the time to think about these enormous issues? This is the biggest crisis most people have ever seen. How do they plan for the future? How do they create reflective time to think that through? How do they have the conversation so they don't become an echo chamber, just listening to one or two people? How do they make sure they have that? So I think there's also a really interesting shift of something that had begun many years ago, but perhaps is even stronger today, is how do you change your culture to not be so much command and control and be much more of a coaching culture? And coaching is obviously a hugely important part of most leadership, but how do you instill that into a business that maybe hasn't gone that route before or is going down that track? Because if you're going to have people working in a much more disparate environment, unless they are able to manage things in a more coaching environment, it's far more difficult to run your business. So I think there's been a massive uplift in the desire to have more mentoring, coaching, and that's for the leaders as well as for the people that work with them.
Stefanie, do you have any thoughts on the psychological aspects?
Yes, thank you, Richard. Just to add to what Francesca has put so nicely, I think a very simple thing that might be overlooked many times is that managing partners are struggling with recognizing that different people have different needs. And it sounds horribly patronizing if I say so, so please bear with me. But it is always easier to lead people that are like you, yeah, and have the same motivational structure, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think this crisis has highlighted very nicely how important it is to be able to lead people who are different from you and from your personality style. And also not only the typical generational thing that younger people might expect different things today than senior partners that are currently in their 50s. But I think that is something, it sounds so simple, but getting it right is not easy. And so spending some time on that and considering how you lead different people of different generations, but also within the same generation in different ways, has become far more important now that you are not working face to face.
There's also quite an interesting aspect, I think, there, which is to do with leadership styles, and some quite interesting research from Daniel Goleman saying that essentially you shouldn't always adopt the same leadership style. Coaching mindset is really, really important, but there are times when actually other styles work really effectively. But unless you have some idea of the people you're actually dealing with, you won't necessarily know which style is the most appropriate. So the empathy piece comes in really, really quickly, I think. So thank you for that. We've got another question on trust and reputation, but particularly in terms of marketing. I know there are 2 points of view on this, and I'll welcome Jonathan's thoughts in a second. But one of the things that we've kind of seen is this whole notion of, and it almost goes back to David Maister's idea of the true professional, when he says that you have a professional obligation to inform your client of things that are going to help them in the current climate. So if you have a particular service or product that you know will be really relevant to a particular client, don't feel, oh, my job is just to inform them, a bit like you were saying earlier, Stefanie, but actually, how can I make sure that they are aware of this client, of this particular service? And that might mean using a full range of marketing tools. But if it's done in the context of something that really, really is relevant to that client, and you've made the effort to find out what that is, then I think actually it is appropriate for you to deploy your marketing skill set, if you like, in order to make sure they're aware of it, because they will be bombarded by noise from other places. Jonathan, your thoughts, please.
Would endorse everything you've said, Richard. Just add two or three things to it. One is that the Edelman Trust research said that organisations which are seen to put profit ahead of people will be penalised in terms of trust. I think the other thing to say is your clients and your prospects will sense your motivation in terms of the messages that you send out. And if you send those messages out with a genuine intention to help your clients, not sell to your clients, then those messages will be well received, particularly if those products and services are indeed relevant to their needs at the moment and are positioned in the context of COVID-19, and if the communication has the right tone of voice. And one final practical thing I would say is, why not test it with a couple of trusted clients before, issuing a mass mailing or changing the website? Just do a little bit of, say, testing with people whose views you trust and who trust you. Get their feedback on it before pressing the button.
And Silicon Valley would have you believe, and I believe they're correct, that you should A/B test actually any changes on your website. You should be able to go to different people and see which messages resonate the most. Well, we've got one other question which has come in around remote working, and do people feel that salaries are going to fall given that people will be not incurring the same amount of money in order to travel to work? I think we're going to have to defer that one till next week, but it's good to have that question to hold over. I think we're now kind of entering that final stage. So I'd like to thank the panel today. I'd like to thank Dave, Stefanie, Jonathan, Francesca and Lucy for their time, energy and effort, because as we all know, coming on and talking for 5 minutes is much harder than talking for 15 minutes. And I'd like to, again, just remind you, if I may, going back to the sort of usual slide, that all the, excuse, get it up, all these videos, there are now, I think we're 10 this week, which is nice to have into double figures, can be seen in the management library, which everybody on the call will have been given the access to. That next Wednesday, we will be exploring a bit more in depth how you might maintain professional relationships while social distancing, from Andy Lapata. And I'm really impressed. We all talk about things that you might be doing when you've got time free because of the lockdown. He's actually written a book and it's already been published. Now, I'm really impressed by that. And that's all about professional relationships and leadership. So he's going to come talk to us a little bit about that. And as I mentioned, we'll be appearing on today's panel, next week's panel, next Friday. The feedback, as always, I can't really say very much other than thank you for that. We've again had a fantastically good group of people on the call today, on the program, and your feedback. And it is, I mean, people are really volunteering. Can I please come on the program? So the next 2-3 weeks are all full already. So that's nice. When I started it up, I thought, well, I might go 13 weeks. We're now 10. And I'm now thinking, well, this is probably going to be running till the end of October, a bit like the extension to the furloughing scheme. So thank you for that. I hope you found today valuable. Please recommend your peers to sign up. Literally in the last hour or so, we had one from Vancouver and one from Warsaw. This is not a small London group. This is genuinely a global community, and it's lovely to have you together. And lastly, we all have our own milk bills, so please consider supporting our work by joining the forum. And if you're interested, you can certainly take it to the next step with that link that I'm showing there. So thank you all, thank you panel, and look forward to having a lovely long weekend if you're in the UK because of obviously the bank holiday. So please take that time out and refresh your batteries, as we've said, and look forward to seeing some of the panel again next week, but also new people and hopefully a few new people in the audience as well. Thank you again and enjoy your day. Bye for now.